You wake to the sound of wedding bells echoing through the vaulted stone of Bordeaux Cathedral. Their notes tumble through the air, solemn yet triumphant, but to your 14-year-old heart they toll more like iron chains than celebration. It is November 25th, 1615, a date etched forever into your destiny. Your hands, still more child than woman, tremble beneath layers of golden Spanish brocade. Attendants adjust the massive jeweled crown that threatens to slip from your head, its weight more fitting for a monarch than a frightened girl. The incense clings to the cold air, curling around you like smoke rising from an altar. Through the haze, your eyes struggle to find him, your bridegroom, Louis, King of France. Only the second time in your short life that you have laid eyes upon him. He is barely older than you, his boyish face still marked with the roundness of youth, his voice only just breaking. And yet today he is king, and today you are to be his queen. He has spent the morning, not in reflection or prayer, but hunting rabbits, more comfortable in fields with hounds than before the altar with you. His eyes, when they flicker toward you, do not hold. They slip away like water on glass, finding the cathedral floor more worthy of attention than the girl meant to be his partner for life. The great church swallows sound like a hungry beast. The Latin chants rise to the vaulted ceiling, drowning the whispered prayers of your Spanish attendants who murmur in Castilian, words that vanish against the tide of foreign syllables. Ana Maria Mauricia, that is who you were, but already they are erasing you. Here they call you Anne. Even your name, the simplest gift of your birth, is stripped away, moulded to fit French tongues. You are no longer the daughter of Philip III of Spain, beloved Infanta of Valladolid, but a pawn moved across the board in a relentless game between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. It is not a love match. It was never meant to be. It is politics dressed in silk and jewels. Your father, Philip, signed away your childhood 3 years ago when you were only 11. Spain pledged 500,000 crowns as your dowry, already calculating how much would be reclaimed if your fragile boy husband were to die young. They had planned everything, the contracts, the feasts, the exchange of titles. Everything, except whether two frightened children could ever find solace in each other's arms. The air is thick with incense, and yet beneath it you catch the faint scent of candle wax melting, of damp stone that never quite dries in this northern climate. You think of the courtyards of Spain where sun baked the tiles until they glowed, where orange blossoms scented every breeze. You think of how different the world feels here, how the French light falls thin and pale, as if reluctant to warm the earth. Around you, nobles crane their necks to glimpse the spectacle. They do not see you as a child, they see you as an alliance made flesh, a contract in brocade and jewels. You imagine how they whisper, "The Spanish bride is small, darker than expected, but her dowry will please France." When the vows are spoken, your lips form the words as if by command, not choice. You glance toward Louis, hoping for a flicker of shared fear, a hint that he too is trapped in this grand theatre. But he remains as still as marble, his face unreadable. He is 14, just as you are, but unlike you, he does not look lost. He looks absent, as though he has already retreated into the only world where he is comfortable, one where falcons answer to his call and dogs chase rabbits across the fields. The ceremony continues, each word binding you tighter. The cathedral hums with power, with history. Here kings are made, wars ended, dynasties secured, and yet standing in that heavy gown, your crown threatening to topple from your young head, you feel less like a queen than a prisoner dressed for execution. What do you know of France, a place where the sun rarely shines, where the language sounds like water running over stones, where your Aunt Isabella once went to marry and never returned? You know only that Spain and France have been enemies for generations, and that your marriage was meant to transform war into a peace as fragile as spun glass. You do not yet know that this peace will be tested again and again, nor that you yourself will become the fulcrum upon which empires balance. The wedding bells continue to ring, their echoes mingling with the chants of the Mass. Each toll reminds you that you will never again see a Spanish sunrise, never again taste gazpacho made from your mother's recipe, never again run barefoot through the orange groves of Valencia. The doors to that life closed when you stepped into this cathedral. Ahead of you is only France, cold, foreign, watchful. And yet, for all the grandeur, for all the spectacle, there is something haunting in the silence between the bells. It is the silence of a child's voice swallowed by history. It is the silence of Anne of Austria's first lesson as queen. Queens are not born, they are forged in sacrifice. The words of the vows still echo in your ears, but your mind drifts back to the day when your fate was first sealed. Not here in France, but in Madrid 3 years earlier. August 1612. You were only 11, seated in the sun-drenched gardens of the Alcazar, scattering breadcrumbs for the peacocks your mother once adored. Their iridescent feathers shimmered under the Castilian sun, brilliant flashes of blue and green dancing across the courtyard. Your laughter that day carried the remnants of a child's innocence, the kind that still believed life unfolded gently. It was your father, King Philip III of Spain, who broke that illusion. He did not ask, he declared. His words fell into the silence of the garden like heavy stones. You will marry the King of France. No explanations, no softening of the blow, no consideration that you were still a child mourning a mother barely gone a year. Margaret of Austria, your mother, had died of childbed fever after bringing your youngest brother into the world, and, in her absence, you had been forced to become a little mother yourself, tending to younger siblings, overseeing prayers, learning how to carry responsibility before you had even learned what freedom tasted like. That day, as your father's voice flattened your future into a decree, the peacocks scattered, startled by the suddenness of his tone. You wished you could fly away with them, but daughters of kings do not fly. They are placed like pawns on a chessboard to guard dynasties. What did you know of France then? Very little. To you it was a distant, shadowed land, a place where the language sounded like stones clattering in a stream, where the sun was said to shine reluctantly. You knew of France mostly through its absence, stories of wars waged between Habsburg and Bourbon, whispers of alliances made and broken. France was the other, the northern rival your family had spent generations battling on fields drenched with blood. And yet, in one moment, France was transformed from rival into destiny. Your father had no patience for hesitation. His gaze was sharp, his words final. You would be Queen of France. The weight of Spain's power rested on your young shoulders, and with it, the expectation that you would secure peace between two kingdoms weary of bloodshed. He did not look at you as a daughter then, but as a treaty given flesh, a political instrument wrapped in silk. And did you protest? No. Even if the thought flickered across your mind, you knew such defiance was dangerous. A princess's silence was her duty. Still in your heart, you grieved for Spain even before you left it. You grieved for the courtyards where laughter once echoed, for the orange groves in Valencia where summer smelled of citrus and salt air, for the familiar rhythms of Castilian prayers whispered before sleep. The negotiations that followed stretched for years, filled with endless calculations and formalities. Courtiers debated dowries, compared portraits, weighed alliances like merchants haggling over goods. Your likeness was painted and repainted, each canvas judged for whether you appeared sufficiently Habsburg, sufficiently pious, sufficiently young yet womanly enough to produce heirs. Behind those portraits was a girl who still cherished Spanish lullabies, who still mourned a mother's embrace. When the French envoy presented the portrait of Louis, your ladies gathered around. The boy who stared back from the canvas had sad eyes, set in a pale, narrow face, his chin too weak to inspire confidence, his frame drowned in lace. Whispers fluttered through the Spanish court. He looked sickly, perhaps fragile, and worse, he was said to prefer the company of his falconer over any woman. His mother, Marie de Medici, still ruled France in all but name, leaving him more puppet than king. What kind of life awaited you with such a boy? But your opinion mattered as little as his. The documents had already been signed, your fate written in ink, long before you could form an opinion of your future husband. It was not about love, it was about peace, a peace as fragile as spun sugar, glimmering under candlelight but destined to melt at the first drop of heat. That evening in Madrid, as the negotiations concluded, you found yourself alone with your thoughts. You walked through the Alcazar's gardens where fountains trickled in soft harmony, where doves cooed from tiled rooftops, where the golden light of Spain lingered against the horizon. You tried to imagine France, a country where no one spoke your language, where even your name would not belong to you. For the first time, you understood that being born royal meant surrendering choice. Your life was not your own, it was Spain's to trade. And so you stood, a girl of 11 listening to the rustling of orange trees, and realized that your childhood had already ended. The marriage that would uproot your life was not a decision sealed in a single moment, but the result of 3 long years of negotiations. 3 years where powerful men argued over your body as though it were a fortress to be ceded, a coin to be spent, or a treaty to be signed. Every clause was dissected, every detail contested. Spain and France had been rivals for generations, enemies locked in an endless seesaw of bloodshed across Europe. For your father, King Philip III, this marriage was not about love or even family. It was about balance. A fragile truce that might soften the Bourbon threat without surrendering Spanish pride. For the French court, it was about prestige and wealth, 500,000 crowns of dowry glittering like sunlight on water. And so, diplomats filled the halls of Madrid with their parchments and seals. Portraits travelled back and forth across the Pyrenees, painted likenesses of you and of Louis, exchanged as though canvas could reveal the soul of a child. Each time your likeness was finished, courtiers would gather around to judge. Was the Habsburg jaw pronounced enough? Were your eyes sufficiently modest, sufficiently virginal, sufficiently docile? In truth, you were a girl with laughter still hidden in your cheeks, with grief still caught in your chest from your mother's death. But on the painted canvas you were a queen in waiting, a symbol polished for foreign eyes. In 1613 a French portrait arrived in Madrid. It was Louis, your intended. The boy's face was pale, his chin weak, his expression uncertain. He wore lace, so lavish it seemed designed to distract from his body rather than display it. Your ladies in waiting crowded around the portrait, whispering like sparrows. He looks fragile. He looks timid. Perhaps he is ill. Others muttered darker rumors that the boy king was uninterested in women, that he preferred hawks and hounds to human company, that his mother, Marie de Medici, ruled while he played. But what did it matter? Your destiny had been written in signatures and seals. No weakness in his chin, no rumour of his inclinations could alter the ink on the treaty. The Bourbons wanted a Habsburg bride, and the Habsburgs wanted peace with the Bourbons. The rest, your heart, his affection, your happiness, was irrelevant. Still, you could not help but wonder what kind of life awaited a girl bound to a boy whose portrait suggested more melancholy than majesty. Did his silence conceal depth, or simply indifference? Would he ever look at you as something more than Spain's offering to France? October 1615 drew near, and with it the elaborate theatre of proxy marriages. On October 18th in Burgos, you stood before an empty chair draped with fleurs-de-lis, the symbol of France. Your brother Philip stood in for Louis, reciting vows that were not his to keep, while you repeated words that bound you to a boy across the mountains. At the same time in Bordeaux, Louis's sister, Elizabeth, was wed to your brother. A double exchange, two princesses traded like exotic birds, neither to see her homeland again. That day, you wore your mother's wedding gown, altered hastily to fit your smaller frame. Its golden threads shimmered in the candlelight, its weight heavy as armor. As you spoke the vows, your voice trembled, not with love, not even with nervousness, but with the realization that your childhood had officially ended. You said "I do" to a chair, pledged your life to an absence. You became wife to a boy you had never met, became bound to a kingdom you had never seen. The Archbishop of Burgos presided, his Latin rising above the hushed murmurs of the crowd. His voice sounded like rain against stone, ceaseless, unyielding, indifferent. You repeated the sacred words, not knowing what they meant beyond finality. To Spain, you were now married. To France, you were still a stranger. When the ceremony ended, your ladies surrounded you, murmuring encouragements, adjusting your gown, holding your trembling hands. But in your heart, you felt only the echo of emptiness. A marriage to an empty throne, a vow to a boy you could not yet imagine, a future wrapped in uncertainty. And yet, across Europe, courts celebrated. Chroniclers noted the alliance with pomp and optimism. Songs were sung, bells were rung, and diplomats congratulated themselves on their cleverness. To them, the union was a triumph of politics. To you, it was the beginning of exile. After the proxy vows were spoken in Burgos, there was no turning back. What remained was the physical passage from one life to another, a journey that would strip away the last traces of Spain and deliver you into the hands of strangers. 40 days it took. 40 days of rattling carriage wheels, endless stretches of mud and stone, and the relentless drumbeat of rain as autumn deepened across Europe. Each morning began with the chill of damp linens in unfamiliar beds. The air smelled of smoke from foreign hearths, of wet wool and mud tracked in by servants. The further north you travelled, the more the land seemed to darken. Spain's sunlight had gilded your childhood, bright courtyards, orange groves, the golden dust of summer. But as your carriage moved into France's shadow, the skies grew heavy, the colours muted. Even food tasted strange, the flavours blander, as if the land itself withheld its warmth. Your Spanish ladies, Doña Estefanía de Vigilan, faithful friend of your late mother, Doña Catalina de Salazar, who had patiently taught you French words, and little Maria de Montemayor, your dwarf companion since childhood, did their best to make the journey bearable. They sang Spanish songs to drown the monotony of rain against carriage roofs. In roadside inns they improvised French court dances, their laughter briefly lifting the gloom. When you woke crying from dreams of home, they held you close, whispering lullabies in the language of your childhood. But the road stretched on without mercy, and each mile seemed to erase Spain a little more. At last, you reached the island of Pheasants on the Bidassoa River, the borderland stage where kingdoms performed their rituals of exchange. A wooden pavilion had been built atop the water, its timbers creaking under the weight of ceremony. On one side stood Spain, on the other France, and in the centre you, belonging to neither, suspended between two worlds. The moment was choreographed like theatre. Spanish officials escorted you halfway across the platform, their faces solemn as if attending a funeral. Your brother Philip embraced you tightly for the last time, whispering in Spanish, "Be brave, little Infanta. Remember, you carry Habsburg blood." His words burned into your heart, equal parts farewell and command. And then he let you go. You walked the rest of the way alone. Each step felt heavier than the last, your slippers echoing against the wood, the dark water rushing beneath. On the far side, French nobles waited with unreadable faces. Behind you, Spain receded. Before you, France loomed. At that same pavilion, another exchange occurred. Your counterpart in this diplomatic trade. Elizabeth of France, Louis's sister, crossed the platform in the opposite direction, weeping openly as she moved toward the Spanish side. Two princesses, strangers to one another, passing in the middle of the river like shadows on a bridge. Neither would ever again see the land of her birth. You remember her face streaked with tears, and for a heartbeat you wondered if your own reflected the same anguish. It was exile for both of you, sealed in ceremony, sanctified by politics. Once the exchange was complete, the French courtiers swept you away, their voices sharp with foreign syllables, their gestures brisk. They carried you forward as if you were cargo unloaded at a port. You looked back once, desperate to catch a final glimpse of your brother, of Spain's banners snapping in the wind. But the pavilion doors closed and the river flowed on, carrying with it the last of your childhood. When you emerged again under the grey French sky, you were no longer Anna Maria Mauritia of Spain. You were Anne of Austria, Queen of France. The carriages rolled forward once more, this time bearing you not as a daughter of Spain, but as the bride of France. The landscape shifted, vineyards and stone villages, peasants pausing in their work to watch your entourage pass. To them, you were a figure glimpsed from afar, a queen cloaked in velvet and jewels, the embodiment of alliance. They did not see the girl hidden beneath the silks, the child silently mourning. And so, after 40 days of road and rain, you arrived in Bordeaux. The French court awaited you, their eyes sharp, their whispers sharper still. The journey had ended, but the exile had only just begun. Your first glimpse of the French court at Bordeaux struck you like a physical blow. In Spain, dignity and restraint ruled every gesture. Gowns were heavy with brocade, concealing curves beneath layers of fabric. Hair was arranged neatly, symbols of modesty and composure. But here everything seemed designed to unnerve you. The French nobility paraded in silks cut to reveal as much flesh as fabric allowed, corsets so low that you could almost see their hearts beating beneath their skin. Jewels glittered on bare necks, diamonds straining against white throats, pearls set in coiffures that defied gravity, held aloft by enough pins to arm a battalion. Their voices filled the chamber in a dozen tongues, French, Italian, German, Dutch, colliding into a cacophony that excluded you. Spanish was conspicuously absent, swallowed as though your language itself were unwelcome. You stood there, freshly arrived, every step weighted with expectation, and felt yourself shrinking beneath their gaze. They saw you not as a girl frightened in a foreign court, but as Spain incarnate, as the Habsburg bride delivered to seal a truce. They measured you with eyes as sharp as daggers, noting the darkness of your hair, the olive tone of your skin. In their whispers, you heard the word Espagnol like a curse, muttered with disdain, and then she approached. Marie de Medici, Queen Mother of France, your new mother-in-law. A woman whose shadow stretched long over this court, whose Italian accent wrapped her French words in suspicion. She circled you slowly, like a merchant inspecting a horse at market. Her heavy rings caught the light as she lifted your chin with one jeweled finger. "She is smaller than expected," she announced, loudly enough for the hall to hear. Her gaze swept you from head to toe. "And darker. Well, Spanish blood. What can one expect?" She studied your teeth as though they were merchandise. "At least she has good teeth. She will breed well enough, God willing." The words sank like poison, each syllable a reminder that you were not a bride to them, but a vessel, a womb draped in Spanish silk, your worth measured in heirs, yet unborn. And then Louis entered. He was 14 like you, born only 5 days apart, a coincidence the court called destiny. But the boy who walked into the chamber did not look like destiny. He looked as terrified as you felt, his hands trembling, his gaze fixed on the floor. When protocol demanded he kiss you, his lips brushed your cheek with all the warmth of dry parchment. The gesture was met with applause, a performance of affection for the benefit of the audience. You, meanwhile, felt nothing but the chill of paper against skin. The court watched the scene with satisfaction. For them, the exchange was complete. The Bourbon heir had accepted his Habsburg bride, the alliance made flesh. For you, it was the first taste of what love meant in France, not intimacy, not tenderness, but performance. That evening, the halls glittered with feasts and music in your honor. Tables groaned under roasted fowl, sugared fruits, and gilded pastries. Minstrels played, courtiers danced, and everywhere the air reeked of perfumes so heavy they masked the scent of sweat and wine. You sat beside your new husband, who spoke little to you and much to his falconer, discussing hunting while ignoring the bride at his side. Twice you tried to begin conversation, once about music, once about family, but each attempt fell flat, his monosyllables dissolving into silence. The Duke of Buckingham, an English guest, would later write of the scene, "Never did I see a bridegroom look more miserable, as if led to execution rather than to a wedding feast." You remember that too, the way Louis's face held none of the joy of a boy newlywed, only the pallor of one cornered by duty. As laughter roared around you, as goblets clashed and violins sang, you sat in silence beside a husband who would not look at you, your every breath reminding you that you were foreign, unwanted, an outsider in a world of strangers. That night, beneath the gilded lights of Bordeaux, you understood. You had crossed not merely a river but a threshold into exile. Spain was behind you, lost forever. France stretched before you, vast and cold, and you stood between them, a child expected to play queen. The wedding feast stretched on for 7 hours, a banquet as endless as it was suffocating. You sat at the high table beside Louis, the boy who was now your husband, and before you lay a spectacle of abundance that mocked the emptiness between you. Platters of roasted swan glistened with saffron glaze, pyramids of sugared almonds sparkled like jewels, and wine flowed endlessly into goblets heavy with gold. Courtiers leaned close, clinking cups, trading jests, their voices swelling into a roar of celebration. To them, the feast was a triumph, the sealing of peace, the binding of Spain and France through holy matrimony. To you, it felt like a theatre in which you had been cast as lead actress in a play you neither auditioned for nor desired. Every bite of food turned to ash in your mouth. Every cheer echoed as a reminder that your life was no longer your own. Louis spoke little. When he did, his words were not for you. He leaned toward his falconer, discussing hawking grounds near Fontainebleau, his pale face illuminated by candlelight, as though he were somewhere far away. Twice you tried to bridge the gulf. Once you asked about music, you had been told he played the lute. He replied with a single word, "Sometimes," before turning away. Another time, you inquired about his family. Again, a clipped answer. "They are well." Then silence. The Duke of Buckingham, an English visitor, watched with keen eyes and later recorded what everyone could already see. The boy king looked miserable, as if led to execution rather than to his bride. You too felt that heaviness, the awareness that this was not a feast of love but of duty, not a celebration of union but of conquest, with you as the conquered. "Around you," the courtiers whispered, their glances sharp as blades. They noted your Spanish complexion, your solemn bearing, your silence beside a husband who refused to meet your gaze. Some smiled politely, others smirked. You could almost hear their judgments. The Spanish bride is cold, unwelcoming, a foreign ornament for the French throne. Already the poison of rumour began its slow work, weaving narratives around your body and your silence. And yet beneath the humiliation you tried to hold your dignity. You sat straight, hands folded in your lap, each gesture measured. In Spain, your mother had taught you that queens must embody gravity, even when surrounded by frivolity. You drew upon that memory, reminding yourself that appearances were armor. Still, you could not escape the awareness that you were 14, a child forced into a role meant for women twice your age. Every time you caught your reflection in a polished silver platter, you saw not a queen but a girl struggling to hide her fear behind borrowed jewels. As the hours dragged on, dancers spun across the floor, their gowns shimmering, their laughter loud. Minstrels played faster, cups spilled, voices rose in drunken revelry. The heat of the crowded hall pressed against you, the scent of roasted meat mingling with sweat and perfume. The noise battered your ears, a storm of merriment in which you were stranded, alone beside the one person who should have been your ally. When the final course was cleared and the last toast given, you were not relieved but only more exhausted, your spirit weighed down with the knowledge of what would come next. This night was not only a feast, it was a prelude, and all of France was waiting, not for you to be welcomed, not for you to be loved, but for you to prove yourself in the most intimate, humiliating way imaginable. The feast ended in applause and cheers, but in your heart you felt only the silence of exile, the growing void between who you were and what they demanded you become. When darkness finally fell, when the candles guttered low and the last of the revellers staggered from the banquet hall, the true ordeal of your wedding day began. The feast had been for the court, but the night belonged to scrutiny. You were led from the hall by a procession of ladies-in-waiting, their faces solemn, their hands brisk, as they stripped away the armor of your gown. In Spain, a bride's chamber was private, sacred, guarded from intrusion. In France, it was theatre. A queen's body was not her own, but a vessel of dynastic continuity, and witnesses were required to confirm its suitability. In the flickering light of a dozen candles, strangers examined you with clinical detachment. Skin unblemished, womb intact, hips adequate for childbearing, hymen present. Each word was dictated aloud and recorded in a ledger by a secretary as though you were an inventory of livestock, not a girl trembling in the cold. 14 years old, naked before 24 courtiers, you learned your first bitter lesson. Queens have no right to modesty. At last, they dressed you again, but not in dignity. They clothed you in a nightgown so sheer it clung like morning mist, leaving little to the imagination of those who had already seen too much. Then with formal gravity, They escorted you through corridors lined with torches until you reached the royal bedchamber. Louis was waiting. He looked no less terrified than you felt, his pale hands trembling, his eyes darting toward the floor. He was a boy trapped in ritual, a king in name, but a child in reality. When the Archbishop of Bordeaux entered to bless the bed, the chamber became a stage once more. Marie de Medici, your formidable mother-in-law, gave explicit instructions, loud, humiliating, her words echoing like commands in a military drill. Court physicians with detached authority explained the mechanics of consummation in excruciating detail, and then mercifully they left. The door closed. Silence fell, but not true silence, for you knew they lingered just outside, listening for sounds, waiting for proof. What happened that night remains obscured by history, whispered in fragments by servants and courtiers. The official record declared the marriage consummated. The next morning, blood-stained sheets were displayed triumphantly to the court as proof. Trumpets sounded, congratulations were offered, France rejoiced. Yet the whispers tell another story, that the blood was not yours, but a chicken's. That Louis spent the night huddled on the far side of the vast bed, refusing to touch you. That the boy king, so paralyzed by fear or disinterest, left his bride untouched despite the weight of an entire kingdom pressing down on him. You never spoke of it, not in letters, not in confidences, not even in prayers. To admit it would have been to court ruin, but the fact remained. Louis would not share your bed again for 4 years. 4 years of empty nights in echoing chambers, 4 years of courtiers watching your belly for signs of life that never came, 4 years of whispers that the Spanish bride was barren. In those first nights, lying alone in a cold bed meant for two, you began to understand the cruel arithmetic of queenship. You had been married not to a husband, not even to a boy, but to an absence, to a silence that stretched across the sheets and gnawed at your heart. The official proclamations announced that the marriage had been consummated, but your reality was very different. The royal bed remained a vast, empty sea, its sheets cold beside you. Night after night, you lay awake, listening for footsteps that never came, staring at the heavy velvet curtains that enclosed your solitude. 4 years passed in this silence. 1,060 nights without your husband's presence, without his touch, without even the comfort of companionship. The French court did not pity you, they watched instead. Every month, courtiers scrutinized your body, whispering when no signs of pregnancy appeared. Physicians were summoned again and again, their examinations invasive, their verdicts merciless. "The Queen's womb is cold," they declared, prescribing grotesque remedies, powders of ground pearls, draughts of bull's blood, concoctions so foul you gagged as you swallowed. Each failure was not Louis's silence, but your supposed defect. And the whispers spread. Some said you were barren, cursed, perhaps not even fully woman. Others speculated that the fault lay with Louis, whose interests seemed to drift toward hawking, hunting, and the company of young men rather than his wife. But no matter how the gossip twisted, the blame always returned to you, the foreign bride whose body had not yet delivered an heir. Your ladies-in-waiting tried to shield you. Doña Estefania would sit beside you in the long, lonely evenings, telling stories of Spain until you fell asleep. Doña Catalina whispered encouragements, urging you to be patient, reminding you that marriages could thaw with time. Little Maria, your dwarf companion, climbed into bed to keep you from crying in the dark, her presence a fragile comfort against the emptiness. Yet even they could not erase the growing isolation. You were surrounded by French courtiers whose language still stumbled in your ears, who smiled politely but never warmly. Every banquet reminded you of your foreignness, your darker hair, your Spanish accent, your quiet dignity misread as coldness. The castles themselves seemed to mirror your exile. In Spain, the Alcazar had been filled with courtyards, fountains, and open sunlight. In France, the stone halls of Blois and Fontainebleau loomed damp and draughty, their corridors endless, their chambers cavernous. The walls felt less like shelter than prison, each one closing in, muffling your voice. You would sometimes stand at the narrow windows, staring across the misty forests, longing for the blaze of Valencia's orange groves. Louis avoided you with an almost desperate determination. He stuttered when nervous, fainted at the sight of bare shoulders, and if he encountered you unexpectedly in a corridor, he would retreat as though you were a ghost. When you were present, he filled his hours with hawks, hounds, and hunting horns, immersing himself in pursuits that required no wife. The court laughed behind their fans. They said you had been married to a boy who found the company of falcons less frightening than the touch of a queen. But their laughter was not kind, it was cruel, another reminder that your worth was measured only in the children you could not bear. Alone in those early years, you began to pray, more fervently than ever before. At the foot of your bed, before images of the Virgin, you whispered in Spanish, though you knew even prayer was not safe from surveillance. You begged for strength, for patience, for the chance to fulfill the role pressed upon you. Yet with every month that passed, every examination, every whispered insult, hope thinned like smoke. The castle corridors echoed with laughter, music, and life, but for you they echoed with silence. A silence so deep it became a companion, a silence that told you, night after night, that you were not a wife, not yet a queen, not even, truly, a woman in the eyes of France, only a shadow waiting to be confirmed by motherhood. In the spring of 1617, everything changed. For 4 years, you had lived in the shadow of a boy husband who ignored you under the watchful eyes of a mother-in-law who despised you, in a court that measured your value only in pregnancies that never came. Then in one violent stroke Louis seized his power, and with it he stripped away what little comfort remained to you. It began with blood on the Pont du Louvre. Concino Concini, the Italian favourite who had dominated French politics through Marie de Medici, was ambushed and assassinated by royal guards. His body was mutilated by a mob, torn apart as Louis watched from a palace window. The boy who would not meet your eyes at dinner now stood over the carnage of his mother's most trusted adviser, claiming his crown not with words but with blood. France whispered that Louis XIII had become king in truth that day. For you, the coup brought not empowerment, but devastation. With Concini's fall, Marie de Medici was exiled from court. And with the Queen Mother's exile came a purge of everything she had protected, including you. Your Spanish attendants, the women who had cradled you through sleepless nights and sung you the lullabies of home, were declared spies, agents of Spain lurking in the Queen's household. It happened on a Tuesday morning in April. You woke to find French guards at your chamber door holding lists in hand. Doña Estefania, who had comforted you in the worst of your nightmares, was given 1 hour to pack. Doña Catalina, who had patiently taught you the twists and curves of French speech, was escorted to a waiting carriage bound for the border. Even little Maria, your companion since childhood, who had shared your bed when you wept at night, was accused of espionage and torn from your side. You begged Louis for mercy. Just one familiar face, you pleaded. Just one voice to remind you of Spain, of your mother's songs, of the child you once were. But the boy, who was now king, was implacable. Spain is France's enemy, he said coldly. You must learn to be French. That was the moment you understood your exile was not temporary, it was permanent. Spain was gone, shut out by decree, erased from your daily life. The palace corridors, already hostile, became unbearable. French ladies replaced your Spanish ones, their courtesy sharp as knives, their loyalty pledged more to Richelieu and court intrigue than to you. They watched you constantly, reported your words, judged your silences. Even your confessor might not be trusted. Where once you had drawn strength from the familiar, you were now stripped bare, forced to survive in a world that relished your isolation. Outside your chambers, France celebrated the coup as the dawning of Louis's reign. Pamphlets praised the young king's decisiveness, declaring that the kingdom was at last free of Italian corruption. But within your chambers, you sat hollow-eyed and bereft, mourning not only the loss of loyal friends, but the last traces of Spain that tethered you to yourself. The boy who would not touch you had finally touched something, power, and in seizing it, he left you utterly alone. With your Spanish attendants gone, you were left adrift in a sea of foreignness. Every day became a lesson in survival, not through defiance, but through forced assimilation. The boy you called husband had made his stance clear. You would learn to be French, or you would remain forever an outsider. And so, piece by piece, Spain was stripped away. The first assault was fashion. In Spain, dignity and modesty reigned supreme. High collars, layers of stiff brocade, gowns that concealed more than they revealed. Here, in France, you were expected to bear yourself. Court gowns plunged low, exposing shoulders and breasts as if the body were merely another ornament for display. When you first stepped into such a gown, you felt naked, humiliated, as if the entire court stared not at a queen, but at a spectacle. Yet you forced yourself to endure it, to raise your chin as though you were armored in pride rather than stripped of modesty. Then came etiquette. Spanish ceremony was formal, but it was clear and purposeful. In France, etiquette was a labyrinth designed not for efficiency but for hierarchy. There were 43 separate steps, you discovered, simply to serve the king a glass of water. To walk across a hall, you had to pause at prescribed intervals, acknowledge nobles of certain rank, and endure their subtle mockery hidden in bows. The simplest tasks became trials, each step another reminder that you were being judged, always judged. Language was the most intimate loss. You had been raised with Castilian prayers whispered at night, with lullabies sung in your mother's voice, with Spanish poetry recited under orange trees. Now those sounds were forbidden luxuries. French was required at all times, even in private. You stumbled at first, your accent thick, your tongue clumsy over foreign syllables. Courtiers smirked behind fans, delighted at each mispronunciation. Slowly, painfully, you learned. Yet even as you spoke French, you continued to dream in Spanish. And each morning, waking with Castilian words on your lips, you felt the ache of exile all over again. Religion, too, was transformed into a weapon of surveillance. In Spain, your faith had been a comfort, a private communion between you and God. In France, confession itself could be dangerous, your words twisted and carried beyond the confessional by those eager to report to Louis or, later, to Richelieu. Even your prayers became measured, guarded, as though heaven itself might betray you. Day after day, you played the role expected of you, dressing in French silks, moving through French ceremonies, speaking French words. Outwardly, you became the queen they demanded, but within a battle raged. Each adaptation felt like a burial, a slow interment of the girl who had once run barefoot through Valencia's courtyards, who had once fed peacocks with crumbs in the Alcazar garden, who had once been Anna Maria Mauricia. The court, for its part, never let you forget that you were foreign. Whispers followed you through corridors, mocking your Spanish complexion, your solemn dignity, your silence. When you faltered, they called you stubborn. When you excelled, they dismissed it as mimicry. You were trapped in a paradox, required to erase yourself, yet never permitted to belong. And Louis, who had stripped you of your household, who had forced this transformation, remained as distant as ever. He avoided you in corridors, fled at the sight of your shoulders, devoted his hours to hawking and hunting. If you hoped your submission might soften him, you were disappointed. His silence remained unbroken, his absence constant. It was in these years that you learned your most bitter lesson. Queenship in France was not about companionship, not about affection, not even about shared power. It was about survival. To survive, you would bend. To survive, you would hide. To survive, you would bury Spain deeper and deeper, until only you could still hear its echoes in the chambers of your heart. The years passed in a haze of isolation and humiliation, but in 1619 a small shift stirred in the frozen landscape of your marriage. Perhaps it was political pressure from Louis's advisers, perhaps merely the realization that a kingdom without heirs was a kingdom at risk, but for the first time in 4 years, Louis came to your chambers. The visits were not romantic, nor even tender. He arrived late at night, expression solemn, movement stiff. He performed what courtiers called marital duty, with the enthusiasm of someone swallowing medicine, then departed before dawn, leaving only silence in his wake. Yet for you these moments, awkward and mechanical though they were, ignited a fragile spark of hope. For the first time there was the possibility of life within you, the possibility that your body might secure your place in this hostile court. And within months you conceived. The announcement rippled through France like a long-awaited trumpet. Church bells rang, hymns were sung. Courtiers who once whispered against you now praised you, their words honeyed with sudden flattery. You carried not only a child, but the fragile future of the Bourbon dynasty. For the first time since arriving in France, you felt as though you were something more than a pawn. You were a vessel of continuity, a queen whose womb might silence her detractors. December 1619, the long months of waiting ended. You labored, praying with every breath that God would grant you strength, that the suffering would be redeemed with life. But when the midwives lifted the swaddled infant, their silence struck like a blade. The child was a perfectly formed boy, Louis's weak chin, your dark hair. But he did not breathe. His chest never rose. His lips never cried. They wrapped him in silk before you could hold him, but you caught a glimpse of his face, your son, your firstborn, and already gone. The court's joy dissolved into accusation. The murmurs began immediately. You must have eaten something unfit, walked too vigorously, harbored thoughts too dangerous. A queen's failure was never circumstance, it was always guilt. Louis stood at the foot of your bed, his face twisted not in grief but in disgust. His only words were, "Try harder next time." 3 months later, you were pregnant again. The physicians imposed strict confinement. No dancing, no walks, no reading, of anything that might excite the humours. They confined you in your chamber, curtains drawn, air stale, as you lay in bed, watching the seasons change beyond windows you were forbidden to open. You felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, wings clipped before they had ever learned to fly. March 1622. Desperate for air, you convinced 2 of your ladies, French women now, since Spain had been stripped from you, to walk with you in the gardens. For a brief moment you felt almost human again, laughing at court gossip, breathing spring air. But your skirts tangled beneath your feet, and you stumbled. It was nothing, a minor fall, hardly more than a slip. But by evening, blood stained the sheets. The second child was gone. Louis's fury was terrible. He stormed into your chambers as you bled, his voice shaking the walls. He accused you of negligence, of sabotage, of murdering his heir. Spanish witch, he spat before courtiers and servants alike. A curse on the House of Bourbon. When you tried to explain, tried to beg his understanding, he slammed his fist against the wall beside your head, his knuckles bleeding.
21 years old, he hissed, and you cannot even perform the one duty for which you were purchased.
Purchased, not married, purchased. The words seared into your soul. The court echoed his rage. Whispers grew sharper, more venomous. Physicians prescribed remedies that bordered on torture, bleeding, purges, charms made from saints' relics. They spoke of your womb as if it were an enemy fortress that must be forced into surrender. Each failure added weight to the rumors. Perhaps you were cursed, perhaps barren, perhaps God himself had rejected you. And yet, despite the grief, despite the accusations, despite the bruises left by words and silences, you still hoped. Each pregnancy rekindled a spark, a fragile candle against the storm. Each loss extinguished it, plunging you deeper into darkness. But always, somewhere in your heart, you prayed that the next time the flame might endure. Grief, in France, never belonged to you. Each stillbirth, each miscarriage was seized by the court, not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as evidence to be scrutinized. You wept in private. In public, you endured interrogations. Physicians prodded and debated your body as though it were a battlefield they could conquer with leeches and incantations. Courtiers whispered that God had cursed you, that Spain had sent a barren bride to weaken the Bourbon line. Each month without a pregnancy fanned the rumors. Each pregnancy lost turned whispers into accusations.
And Louis did not grieve with you, he raged.
When the second child slipped away after your stumble in the gardens, his fury knew no bounds. He stormed into your chambers while you still bled, his words sharp as blades. "You murdered my heir," he shouted before the gathered ladies, his face twisted with contempt. Careless or worse, deliberate. His voice carried through the halls, so that the entire court knew your shame. When you tried to speak, to beg his understanding, he struck the wall beside your head so hard his knuckles split. His blood spattered across the white stone, a stain that lingered long after he stormed out. You lay trembling, not from fear of his violence against your body, for he never touched you, but from the realization that his hatred was complete. To him, you were not a wife, but a failed vessel, a Spanish witch whose womb poisoned the succession. By 1624, the cycle had become unbearable, pregnant, hopeful, bleeding, grieving, again and again. 4 stillbirths in total, 4 tiny coffins carried away before you could even memorize their faces. And each time, Louis's eyes grew colder, his disgust sharper. The court physicians, desperate to shift blame, invented new tortures, diets of boiled herbs and bitter stones, elixirs of ground coral mixed with wine, prayers to obscure saints invoked at midnight. You obeyed them all, swallowing each remedy like penance, even as they made you gag or left your body weaker. Still, the rumors grew. Some said your womb was too cold to sustain life, others that your Spanish blood carried a curse meant to extinguish France's line. A few whispered that you were not a true woman at all, that some hidden defect made you incapable of bearing children. And while you suffered these humiliations, Louis turned his face from you entirely. He surrounded himself with huntsmen, falconers, and favorites, spending more nights with his dogs than with his queen. Yet, in the silence of your chambers, something hardened within you. If you could not soften Louis's disdain, if you could not silence the whispers, you could at least endure them. You began to carry yourself differently, not as a supplicant, but as a survivor. When courtiers mocked your accent, you answered in flawless French. When they sneered at your solemnity, you wore it like armor, refusing to give them tears in public. When physicians pronounced you barren, you held their gaze with quiet defiance, as though daring them to say the words again. Alone, you wept for the children who never lived, for the love that never came, for the homeland you would never see again. But in public, you began to cultivate what exile demanded, steel hidden beneath silk. For if you could not be cherished as a wife or blessed as a mother, you would learn instead to survive as a queen. As the years wore on, a new figure emerged from the shadows of French politics, a man whose presence would come to define your life as surely as your loveless marriage, Cardinal Richelieu. Where Louis was timid, hesitant, a boy who preferred falcons to statesmen, Richelieu was sharp as a blade and cold as winter stone. His words were measured, his gaze calculating, his loyalty given not to individuals, but to France itself, or at least to his vision of France. Richelieu had no affection for you. From the beginning he regarded you with suspicion, a Spanish princess whose loyalties might waver should war break out between your homeland and your adopted kingdom. He was not the type to be swayed by beauty or by pity. Some whispered that early in his tenure he approached you with propositions, personal as well as political, and that when you rebuffed him, his dislike hardened into enmity. Whether or not the rumors were true, you soon learned the cardinal's attention was a burden, not a shield. Unlike Louis, who ignored you, Richelieu watched you constantly. He understood the danger of silence, the power of secrets, and so he filled your household with spies. Ladies-in-waiting reported your words, servants rifled through your belongings. Even your confessor betrayed you, carrying whispers of your prayers back to the cardinal's ears. There was no safe space, no private thought. Every sigh, every letter, every glance could be twisted into treason. You learned to protect yourself the only way you could, through concealment. You spoke only of trivialities, weather and fashion, meaningless chatter that gave nothing away. You buried your true thoughts so deeply within yourself that at times even you struggled to find them. Yet amid the suffocating surveillance, one unexpected light appeared. Marie de Rohan, Duchesse de Chevreuse, a brilliant and audacious woman who became your confidant. Through her you discovered the subtle art of resistance, not open defiance, which would have destroyed you, but quiet maneuvering, patience, and the gathering of allies. Chevreuse taught you that power in France was not seized through passion, as in Spain, but through endurance, through the slow, careful weaving of influence. Still, Richelieu's shadow grew longer. By 1604 he had risen to chief minister, and with his ascent your life became a chessboard upon which you were both piece and player. Every letter you wrote to your brother in Spain risked discovery. Every visit to a convent could be painted as conspiracy. The cardinal whispered in Louis's ear, fanning his suspicions, feeding his natural mistrust, until your very presence seemed an act of espionage. Louis, malleable in his fears, listened. He, who already found it easier to turn away from you than toward you, began to treat you not merely with neglect, but with suspicion. You were no longer just the barren wife, the foreign queen who failed to produce heirs. Now you were a potential traitor, a Habsburg agent in the heart of France. It was Richelieu's gift to transform even loneliness into liability. Yet in this crucible of suspicion and surveillance, you began, slowly, painfully, to change. You learned that survival was not merely endurance, but adaptation. That to live beneath the gaze of men like Richelieu, you must learn to play their game. To watch as you were watched, to calculate as you were calculated, to speak less and think more. It was a lonely transformation, born of necessity. But one day, in years to come, it would allow you not merely to survive, but to rule. By the mid-1630s, the web Richelieu spun around you had tightened into a noose. France and Spain, once tenuously bound by your marriage, were now enemies again. In 1635, war was declared. Your homeland, your brother Philip IV, now upon the Spanish throne, became the enemy you were expected to hate. Every heartbeat of loyalty to Spain was treason. Every memory of childhood was a liability. And yet you could not cut Spain from your soul. You wrote to your brother in secret, not of troop movements or politics, but of loneliness, of fear, of the unbearable isolation that had become your daily life. Those letters, innocent in sentiment though dangerous in context, became your undoing. In 1637, Richelieu's spies intercepted them. It was not difficult. The cardinal's eyes were everywhere, his ears in every chamber. He read your words, private cries of the heart, and twisted them into daggers. To Louis they were not letters of sorrow, but dispatches of espionage. To the council they were evidence of treachery. They dragged you before the king's council as though you were a common criminal, not their queen. The chamber was crowded, heavy with the smell of parchment and ink, the gaze of men who had already judged you before a word was spoken. Richelieu presented his case with theatrical precision. Each letter was read aloud, your words stripped of context, recast as code. You had written to your brother of your wish to see his face again. Richelieu declared it proof of conspiracy. You had confessed your loneliness. Richelieu painted it as manipulation. He accused you even of plotting marriage with Gaston d'Orléans, Louis's brother, should the king die. The accusation was so absurd, so grotesque, that a bitter laugh escaped your lips. The chamber echoed with it, a sound of broken defiance. "If I wished to escape my misery by remarriage," you said, your voice sharp with scorn, "why would I choose another French prince? If I were the Spanish spy you claim, would I not flee to Madrid the moment I was widowed?" Your words hung in the air like smoke, sharp and undeniable. For a moment even Louis faltered. He sat, impassive as stone, but you could see in his eyes the flicker of something, uncertainty, perhaps, or shame. This man who had been your husband for 22 years, who had blamed you for every stillbirth, who had stripped you of every comfort, now listened to your defense as though you were a stranger. The council deliberated. Execution was considered. Some argued that France would be safer if you were silenced forever. Exile was suggested, though it risked enraging Spain. In the end, they chose something more insidious, not death, but surveillance, not banishment, but a life lived under constant watch, your every step recorded, your every word reported. You would remain queen, but only in name. It was, perhaps, the cruelest sentence. You returned to your chambers not free, not vindicated, but stripped of the last illusions of safety. You knew now with certainty that you were utterly alone, without allies, without trust, without even the comfort of your own thoughts. You were Queen of France, yet as powerless as any prisoner locked behind iron bars. And in that lowest point, you realized a truth that would shape the rest of your life. Survival would not come from innocence, nor from honesty, nor from love. It would come from endurance, from learning to move silently within chains, from patience, cunning, and the willingness to become steel where once you had been flesh. The Spanish girl who had come to France in silks was gone. What remained was a woman tempered by suspicion, grief, and humiliation. A woman the court had not yet learned to fear, but one day they would. It was the winter of 1637, bitterly cold, when fate intervened in the most unlikely of ways. For 22 years you had been wife to a man who would not touch you, a queen without children, a woman whose very survival depended on silence. You had endured humiliation, suspicion, accusations of treason, and now, after so much emptiness, a storm changed everything. Louis had planned to travel to Saint-Maur, but the weather made the roads impassable. Snow fell thick across Paris, the Seine groaned with ice, and winds lashed against the city like an angry god. Protocol demanded the king remain at the Louvre, but the only appropriate chamber for his rank was in your apartments. For the first time in years, he had no choice but to share your bed. The moment was almost surreal. You were 36 years old, no longer the frightened child bride of 14. The years had carved resilience into your face, had taught your voice to hold dignity, even in despair. And yet, when Louis entered your chamber, you felt the same anxious flutter you had known as a girl, the hope that perhaps even after decades of silence, he might see you. What passed between you that night, no one can say. The court would whisper for centuries, spinning tales of reconciliation, of divine intervention, of trickery. Did anger give way to tenderness? Did loneliness, heavy as lead, recognize itself in another soul? Did simple biology triumph over decades of mistrust? You never spoke of it, and Louis would not either. The only certainty was that for one night the silence broke. 9 months later, on September 5th, 1638, the bells of Paris rang with a joy the kingdom had long since given up hoping for. You bore a living son. The court went mad with celebration. Bonfires lit the night. Church bells tolled without pause. Priests declared it a miracle, a gift from heaven itself. Your son was christened Louis Dieudonné, Louis, God-given, as if the heavens had intervened to save the Bourbon line after decades of drought. You, who had been scorned as barren, cursed, unworthy, now carried in your arms the heir of France. The same courtiers who had whispered against you for years now fell at your feet, praising you as blessed among women. They kissed your hands. They called you Mother of the Future. The transformation was dizzying, cruel in its irony. Louis came to see the child, but his eyes avoided yours. He looked upon the infant, his heir, with relief. You, his wife, the woman who had delivered this miracle, remained invisible. Perhaps he suspected the whispers already beginning to coil through the court. That a child born after so many barren years might not truly be his. Some said God had intervened, others muttered that another man had, but you did not care. You had your son. And then, scarcely 15 months later, in September 1640, another miracle, you bore a second son, Philippe, Duke of Orléans. 2 healthy princes after years of emptiness. The court physicians who had once declared your womb a tomb now proclaimed it blessed. The court that had mocked you now bowed to you. The girl once accused of being a Spanish curse had become the savior of the Bourbon dynasty. For the first time in your life in France you belonged, not as wife, not as queen, but as mother. And though Louis remained cold, though Richelieu's shadow still lingered, you no longer cared as much. You had your children. They were yours in a way no decree, no exile, no suspicion could take away. The bells that had once tolled like chains at your wedding now rang like triumph. And for the first time, you dared to believe that perhaps survival had not been in vain. At last, after 23 barren years, you were a mother. Louis Dieudonné, God-given Louis, rested in your arms, his small face pressed to your breast, as you nursed him yourself. The court gasped in scandal at the sight of a queen feeding her own child, for royal infants were meant to be passed to wet nurses immediately. But you would not yield him to strangers. You had waited too long, endured too much, suffered too many small coffins lowered into the earth. These children would be yours in every possible way. You sang them Spanish lullabies when no one was listening, whispered prayers in Castilian while rocking them to sleep, teaching them a language the court would not permit you to speak aloud. You watched them through every fever, every restless night, clutching them to your chest as though your love alone might shield them from the cruelty you had endured. You poured into them all the affection denied to you by your husband, all the warmth stripped away by the French court. For a few fleeting years you felt something close to joy. Philippe's birth in 1640 cemented your place as not merely queen, but mother of 2 Bourbon princes. France rejoiced again, and for once the whispers turned to praise. The courtiers who had sneered at your barrenness now fawned, reminding you that they had always believed you would succeed. It was a bitter kind of triumph, but triumph nonetheless. Yet Louis himself remained unchanged. He visited rarely, speaking little, his eyes still avoiding yours. He acknowledged the children, yes, especially Louis Dieudonné, the precious heir, but he never looked at you as though you were anything more than a vessel, a means to an end. Whatever fragile intimacy had passed during the storm of 1637 had vanished with the snow. By 1642 his health had begun to crumble. Tuberculosis hollowed him, his coughs tearing through palace corridors, blood on his lips. The court grew tense, aware that the king who had scarcely ruled in spirit might soon be lost in body. Richelieu too was dying, though even from his deathbed he worked tirelessly, his iron grip on France unrelenting. You might have felt relief had your own future not been placed once again in jeopardy. For Louis, bitter to the end, crafted a final cruelty. His will decreed that upon his death you would not rule as regent in truth. Instead, a council of men would govern in your son's name, with you no more than a figurehead. Queen Mother in title, but stripped of power. Even as you had delivered him heirs, even as you had endured decades of humiliation, he sought to bind you from beyond the grave. May 14th, 1643, Louis XIII died at the age of 41. You stood at his bedside dressed in black Spanish silk, your face unreadable as his breath rattled one final time. His last words were not for you, but for his son. Be a better king than I was. Then his eyes closed, and the boy who had been your tormentor became history. You should have been free then, free from the cold marriage bed, from the endless cycle of blame and silence. But his will still hung over you, threatening to cage you even in widowhood. The French court watched with anticipation, eager to see you reduced to a powerless mother, a queen in name only. But they had underestimated what exile, humiliation, and grief had made of you. You were no longer the trembling girl of 14, no longer the silent wife of 23 barren years. You had survived Louis. You had endured Richelieu. And you had learned, in the crucible of suspicion and loneliness, how to play the game of power.
The king was dead. Long live the Queen Mother.
Louis XIII was gone, his body laid in the solemn darkness of Saint-Denis, but his shadow lingered in the form of his will, a document crafted to shackle you even after his death. According to its clauses, you were Queen Mother only in name. Real authority over France was to rest with a regency council, a ring of cautious men who would govern while your 4-year-old son carried the title of king. It was Louis's final insult, the last attempt of a husband who had never trusted you to deny you power. But exile, humiliation, and 28 years of survival had taught you a skill Louis never mastered. Patience sharpened into cunning. Within days of his death you summoned your courage, dressed yourself not in mourning silence, but in the black silks of authority, and appeared before the Parliament of Paris. The air inside the chamber was thick with candle smoke, with the rustle of parchment, with the murmur of men expecting a meek widow. They thought you would accept Louis's will with bowed head, resigning yourself to a ceremonial role. Instead, you stood tall, your Castilian eyes blazing with a fire they had never seen. You spoke in flawless French without hesitation, your accent so faint they could no longer use it to mock you. You reminded them of your service, of the years you had endured without complaint. You reminded them that you had given France not one, but two princes, that you had fulfilled your duty where others doubted you could. And then, with a stroke of brilliance, you turned their prejudice into your weapon. "I am a woman," you said, "and a foreigner. Therefore I will depend entirely on the wisdom of you, the men of France. But France must have a strong hand guiding her king. You must allow me to be that hand." It was flattery wrapped in necessity. The Parlement, pleased by the illusion of their own importance, voted to break the dead king's will. Authority that Louis had denied you in life was placed firmly into your hands in death. Your first act as regent shocked them further. You chose as chief minister Cardinal Mazarin, the protégé of Richelieu himself. But where Richelieu had been steel, Mazarin was silk. Where Richelieu had sought to control, Mazarin sought to support. Whispers spread quickly that he was more than your minister, that he was your confidant, your companion, perhaps even your lover. Some even claimed you had married in secret, the Spanish queen finally finding tenderness in the arms of an Italian cardinal. Whether or not the rumors were true, Mazarin became your partner in power, guiding you through the treacherous waters Louis had left behind. You were no longer the lonely child bride waiting for a husband's attention, nor the barren queen mocked for her failures. You were the regent of France, mother to the king, the woman who held the future of the Bourbon dynasty in her hand. And when the nobles tested you, when rebellions smouldered in the streets during the Fronde, you proved to them that survival had forged more than endurance. It had forged courage. The years of your regency were not gentle. France in the 1640s was a kingdom simmering with unrest, its nobles restless under the yoke Richelieu had left behind. They tested you, assuming a foreign widow with 2 young sons would crumble under pressure. Instead, they discovered steel where they expected silk. The Fronde, the great rebellion of nobles and parliament, erupted in fire and fury. Riots shook Paris, crowds pressed against the palace gates, demanding concessions, threatening your life and that of your children. More than once, you were forced to flee in the night, smuggling your sons through hostile streets. There is a story, retold with awe, of how you concealed the young Louis XIV in a laundry basket, and Philippe in servant's clothes, slipping them out under the cover of darkness while mobs shouted for blood outside the palace walls. Yet even in the darkest hours you held your ground. When rebels burst into the young king's bedchamber to confirm he had not fled, you stood calmly beside his bed, pulled back the curtains yourself, and revealed him sleeping peacefully. "Gentlemen," you said with perfect composure, "the king is here as you see. I trust you will allow his majesty to continue his rest." Shamed, they withdrew. In that moment, they saw not a foreigner, not a powerless widow, but a queen whose dignity could silence swords. Throughout those years, Cardinal Mazarin remained at your side, your chief minister, your advisor, and perhaps your companion in a way Louis XIII had never been. Together, you maneuvered through intrigue, bribed enemies, divided factions, and outlasted the storm. When the Fronde finally collapsed in 1653, it was clear. Anne of Austria had held France together when others sought to tear it apart. Your regency ended in 1651 when Louis XIV, at 13, was declared of age, but everyone knew the truth. Though your son wore the crown, it was your hand that had kept it on his head. You negotiated treaties, secured alliances, and preserved the monarchy through fire and rebellion. You, the Spanish bride once mocked as barren, had become the mother of the Sun King. In your later years, as Louis began to rule in his own right, You receded from the center of power. Mazarin remained your closest ally until his death in 1661. Some said you wept not for a minister but for a partner, the one man who had truly stood beside you. Others whispered that his last gift to you, a fortune in jewels, was proof of a bond deeper than politics. Perhaps it was love at last, or perhaps only companionship born of shared struggle. You never said. You turned increasingly toward faith. You rebuilt the convent of Val-de-Grâce, dedicating it to the Virgin Mary, the only presence who had never betrayed you. Within its quiet cloisters, you found a peace the court had long denied you. There you prayed in Spanish when no one could hear, clinging to the last fragments of the girl you once were. Illness came at the end, breast cancer gnawing at your body with a slow cruelty. Yet you faced death as you had faced life in France, with dignity that concealed despair, with silence that masked suffering. On January 20th, 1666, at the age of 64, you died, having outlived Louis XIII by 23 years, the exact span you had endured in childless marriage. Fate, it seemed, delighted in symmetry. History remembers you as the mother of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the woman who safeguarded his throne until he could wield it himself. Yet that is only part of your story. Beneath the crown and the regency, there was always the girl from Spain, the child forced to cross a river at 14, the bride examined like livestock, the queen blamed for every empty cradle. She survived humiliation, exile, suspicion, and treason, and in surviving, she discovered power. But at what cost? The court painted you as triumphant, yet triumph and tragedy were woven inseparably into your life. You saved a dynasty, but you buried a self. You gave France 2 kings, but you lost Spain forever. Even now, in the echoing halls of Versailles, your portrait lingers, dark eyes staring out, not with serenity, but with something sharper, the gaze of a survivor who paid too much for survival. Anne of Austria, mother of the Sun King, regent of France. Anna Maria Mauricia, the Spanish girl who once fed peacocks in a sunlit courtyard. Both names belong to you, both stories are true, and both still haunt the silence between the tolling of wedding bells.